All right, so today I will be talking about a book
That I recently read. It's about. Give me 1 second. Here we go. Alright, so this book is about a Spanish conquistador by the name of Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, which means his last name Cabeza de Vaca means literally head of the cow or head of a cow. Um, and he received that name. It wasn't him. It was one of his ancestors who actually helped in the conquest of Seville. Uh, he was a shepherd, and he helped the king of Aragon, or maybe Leon. I'm not sure. It was probably Aragon. He helped the king figure out a pass to gain easier access to Seville, and he helped the king, and then because of that, the king ennobled him, and then he took on as his name Cabeza de Vaca because he used the head of a cow to mark the location that he was gonna lead the king through. So there's that. Anyway, so Alvar was he became the treasurer of an expedition that left Spain to go travel to Florida, and I'll look up the year in a minute. But so he goes. He becomes not only he's the treasurer, but also he is something like a sheriff. So he's like the master at arms. And anyway, so the Narvaez expedition started in 1527. And it intended to establish colonial settlements and garrisons in Florida. I'm reading this off of Wikipedia. The expedition was initially led by Panfilo de Narvaez, who died in 1528. More men died as the expedition traveled west along the unexplored Gulf Coast of the present-day United States and into the American Southwest. Only 4 of the expedition's original members survived, reaching Mexico City in 1536. These survivors were the first known Europeans and Africans. That's another thing about this. To see the Mississippi River and to cross the Gulf of Mexico and Texas. Okay, so I'll tell you a little bit more about the expedition, and then I'll read a little bit more of this article, and then we will get to it. But let me bring it up so that y'all can see it. Anyway, and that's so we're gonna be reading about this dude. He's a bad motherfucker, and yeah, he's a good one, as we call them in the industry. Oh wait, right there, ha, bam. Okay, so we're gonna read a little bit about this. Narvaez's crew initially numbered about 600 men, including men from Spain, Portugal, and Greece, and Italy. The expedition met with disaster almost immediately. Making stops at Hispaniola and Cuba on the way to Florida, the fleet was devastated by a hurricane, among other storms, and lost 2 ships. After landing near Sarasota Bay, the expedition was split, with 300 men sent overland in search of gold. They encountered numerous attacks by indigenous peoples and suffered from disease and starvation. By September 1528, following an attempt by survivors to sail on makeshift rafts from Florida to Mexico, only 80 men survived after being swept onto Galveston Island off the coast of Texas. The stranded survivors were enslaved by Native American tribes, and more men continued to die from the harsh conditions. Only 4 of the original party, Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, Alonso del Castillo Maldonado, Andrés Dorantes de Carranza, and Dorantes enslaved Moor Estebanico. His name was probably Estebanico Zemmouri or Estebanico Dorantes, whichever. survived the next 8 years, during which they wandered through what is now the southwestern United States and northern Mexico. They eventually encountered Spanish slave catchers in Sinaloa in 1536, and with them the four men finally reached Mexico City. Upon returning to Spain, Cabeza de Vaca wrote of the expedition in La Relación, published in 1542, as the first written account of North America. With later additions, it was published under the title Naufragios, which means shipwrecks in Spanish. So that's the basic information about the Narvaez expedition, what it was about, you know. So the story starts when Alvar is, you know, they're sailing towards Mexico from Florida, trying to do it, and I heard the audiobook version of Naufragios in English, which in English it's the journey of Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca. You can find it on YouTube. It's by LibriVox. It's free, and it's a really cool audiobook. It's very interesting. Anyway, so in that memoir, Alvar recalls that the crew of 80 men decided that they were going to take their shirts and make sails, makeshift sails, make these boats. They were going to slaughter their horses and then strip the leather or the skin from their legs and use them as bags, all this stuff. But they didn't have no blacksmiths. They didn't have anybody that could do any of this. So they were kind of lost in the sauce. Anyway, they did it. Within a couple days, the bags are rotting. So they kill their horses for nothing. Everything goes to shit. Nobody really, Alvarez's boat is, full of sick people, wounded people. They start drinking salt water because they're so thirsty. And they actually get abandoned by a crew of healthier men who say, look, right now Spain ends here, we need to survive, so don't worry about orders, worry about survival. So every man survive for himself. Okay, fine. They end up crashing on Galveston Island. When Alvar calls it the island of the misfortunes, because he gets enslaved there. At first, the Indians help him out, do this and that. They find them roots. They do this and that. They even cry with them. But eventually, they get sick of taking care of these people. So they enslave them. They're like, look, you gotta help us. So whatever. They get enslaved. And eventually, Alvar is kind of taught, or kind of, they demonstrate to him the ways in which the shamans work. So they cure people by blowing on them. So Alvar, he kind of starts doing that, but instead of just blowing on the people, he blows and then he does the sign of the cross, supposedly. I actually suspect that he was doing a lot more. He was actually learning a lot of the shamanism and actually just practicing it raw. The thing about that is, this is the time of the Spanish Inquisition. So if he starts talking craziness about how he was doing all these paganistic, shamanistic things in the Americas, they'll hang him. And that was actually one of the themes of the movie, because there's actually a movie based on the book. It's from Mexico. It's in Spanish. The subtitles are kind of messed up, but I only know that because I speak Spanish. Anyway, so I suspect that he didn't tell the whole story, but apparently he blew on the people and did the sign of the cross and said, Padre Nuestro, we call it in Spanish. I forgot what they call it in Our Father who art in heaven, the Lord's Prayer. So he learns how to do this. He cures people by some miracle. A lot of the people heal. He ends up becoming a trader. He's still a slave, but he's a trader. And like trading, not a traitor, but a trader. And he begins trading shells and things that are of the local area for other things, for food and other items to Indians, bows and all kinds of things. And then he brings them back, that's how he makes a small little living. But then he's also enslaved by these people. He eventually meets with Dorantes, Castillo, and Estebanico because everybody in that little area gathers for a market kind of thing. Not really like a market, but like a fair where they go and they find some sort of plant. I think it's prickly pear, which they call tuna in Spanish. And in the book, they actually use the word tuna for most of the book. And I actually was thinking, as I was listening to this audiobook, they should have changed his name to Cabeza de Tuna, because this motherfucker did nothing but eat tuna the whole time. And that's pretty much the only food that this dude had access to. Like, they had some venison and things like that. But for the most part, in the very beginning, he was eating prickly pear until they could find corn. And, so whatever, they were eating raw corn and things like that. But Alvar ends up deciding to escape with Dorantes, Castillo, and Estebanico. And I believe Dorantes or Castillo was always hesitant throughout the years. A few years passed, I'd say like maybe, I think it was like maybe 3 or 4 years passed. And Alvar was like, look, I'm tired. I'm sick of it. I gotta figure out what I'm gonna do. And he tells them, look, if y'all don't come, if you all don't decide to come with me on this journey, then I'm just gonna take the journey and I'm gonna do it myself, and y'all can stay here. So eventually the men are like, fuck that, I'm not staying behind, and they decide to leave. And Arval ends up leading them, kind of leading them through the desert. And he's with these natives. He goes to a village, he heals people there. He heals somebody from apparently a coma, but people think the person's dead. Alvar somehow apparently cures this person. They wake up from the coma, but like I said, everybody thinks the person's dead, so they think Alvar's powers are just immense. So he stays with the Indians for a couple days, maybe like a couple weeks, decides to leave, goes to another tribe, but the Indians follow him and the crew. He becomes so overwhelmed with all the work of doing the shamanism that he just tells all the other 3 dudes, look, you all have to participate. You all have to be healers. You all have to be medicine men, because I can't, take it. Because there's hundreds of people, eventually thousands of people. And the crazy thing is that it gets to a point when they're wandering through the desert and they finally have thousands of people that everybody wants to have them blow on the food, on their food, or else they won't eat it. So they want one of the 4 shamans to blow on the food and sign the cross, or else they won't eat food. So they have to blow on thousands of meals, apparently, so that the Indians will eat it. Otherwise, they won't even look at the food. A curious thing about the cult, I'll call it cult. I don't actually mean like a cult in the modern sense, but I mean like a cult in, the sense of like a form of worship or something like that, like a cargo cult type situation or whatever. The cult that develops, the culture that develops around Alvar and the 3 other men is really weird. These Indians follow them around, and when they encounter a village, the Indians in Alvar's crowd will rob the village, the new village. They'll rob everybody in the village, and Alvar will be saddened by it, but he just lets it go because he's like, look, that's just the custom. But the Indians would tell the Indians that they just robbed, they would be like, look, that's just the tradition, that's just how we do it. If you don't give us all your shit, the shamans will get mad and you're gonna die. But if you travel with us, the next village that we go to, you just rob their shit, and then you'll have all your shit again. So it got to a point where all the villagers were just doing that, and that's why it got, he ended up having like anywhere from 3,000 to 4,000 followers, because people were just trying to get their shit back and traveling with these dudes, and it became like a really crazy thing. It got to the point where they had 6 different language groups. They had one language in common. I forgot which one it was, but in the way they describe it, they say that it was as difficult as Euskar. Euskar is otherwise known as Basque. The Basque language, which is a language from Spain, from the Basque country, which isn't related to any Indo-European language. The majority, all the languages even the Arabic, most of the languages in the Arabian Peninsula, or not the Arabian, but the Iberian Peninsula, are influenced by Arabic. But they're all Romance languages, except for Basque. So at the time, it was, nearly impossible for a Romance speaker to understand. So when he says that the language, the lingua franca of the Indians was it was like their Euskar, he's meaning that it was as difficult to understand as Euskar. And they actually used it as a lingua franca, and they also used it as a way to, Alvar used it to communicate among the group of shamans once they reached Mexico. So they had that. And yeah, these dudes wandered for 8 years. From Galveston Island from Florida to Galveston to Mexico. 8 years. They finally encountered a slave catching expedition, and the men, the Alvar and the Spaniards and the Moor, they screamed out for them. They're like, yeah, we're soldiers, we're servants of the King of Spain, King Philip, blah, blah, blah. What date is it? And they told them, and Alvar bugged out. He didn't believe it. He wanted it certified. That's what happened. And they ended up going back to Mexico. Before all that happened, though, the slavers wanted to enslave all the Indians, and they eventually did. They were building a cathedral or something like that, and they needed people, so whatever. When the Indians, they didn't want to go. The Spanish sent translators to tell the Indians, look, these dudes are wretched losers, they suck, but they're from us. They are of our people. They're of our tribe, the Spanish. But we are the conquerors of this land, and we're the masters of this land. They're losers, but we're the masters of this land, and you have to obey us, and you have to come back with us and help us build these cathedrals. And the Indians were like, no, you are most definitely, there's no relation between you and the shamans, and this is why. They come from where the sun rises, because the 4 shamans were known as the sons of the sun, which I'm also a son of the sun, so I can appreciate when my brothers are doing things. So was Socrates. He's also a son of the sun. There are several million probably. I don't even know. Anyway, but they were considered sons of the sun, and they came from where the sun rose, whereas the Spaniards came from where the sun set. That was one of the reasons the Indians gave for not wanting to obey the slave catchers. So they're like, no, they come from where the sun rises. You come from where the sun sets. They don't wear no clothes and give everything away. You wear clothes and take everything that is in yours. They heal the sick. You kill the healthy. So you're definitely not related to them because they're sons of the sun. You people are just crazy conquerors. But that was the fight. Eventually, some Indians got enslaved, some ran away. But Alvar and Estebanico and Dorantes and all these people, they end up getting rescued. And that's pretty much the end of the journey. Alvar becomes governor of Argentina for a little bit, Rio de la Plata, but he ends up going back to Spain in chains. Estebanico, he ends up either being sold or joining an expedition to go to New Mexico. He ends up becoming one of the discoverers of New Mexico, and apparently he's killed by Pueblo Indians. And then Dorantes and Castillo, I don't really know what the hell happened to them because they're like lame. They were the two lamest parts of the story. Because Dorantes was a damn slaver, and the Castillo's like whatever. But let's see what happened to Castillo last year's. When the governor of New Galicia, Nuño de Guzman, received news that the Spanish castaways had reached the land under his jurisdiction, he provided them with horses and clothing and sent them to Mexico City to provide accounts to the viceroy of New Spain, Antonio de Mendoza. The story was already known in the city, and they had received great honors. Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca recounted his experiences in the book Naufragios, in which he recounts the period of slavery with the natives and the long march to find his way back to the Spanish. Alonso de Castillo married in Mexico and was the beneficiary of the encomienda of his wife in Tehuacan, Puebla. So as comendero, he was awarded a quarter of the income of Tehuacan, so he made out good. In 1541, he traveled to Spain to claim his inheritance because his father had died while he traveled across North America, and some relatives had already inherited. He stayed briefly in Spain before returning to the Americas, living the rest of his life in New Spain. In 1545, Castillo served as treasurer at Guatemala. In 1547, Alonso del Castillo was listed as a witness in a trial and presented information of his labor service or any person from the crown because he lived in poverty. It is believed that he died in the late 1940s. So yeah, he died in poverty even though he was a comendero. And let's see what happened to Dorantes. Okay. Okay. Mendoza offered Dorantes, so Mendoza is the governor of New Galicia. Mendoza offered Dorantes a position leading a new expedition, but Dorantes refused and instead made plans to return to Spain. Dorantes sold Estebanico to the viceroy. However, when he was preparing to leave, his ship was pronounced unfit to sail, forcing him to return to the port of Veracruz. After this, Dorantes never left New Spain again. He died in the 1950s. Wow. Dorantes married María de la Torre, the widow of Francisco de Valdez de la Torre. De la Torre was owner of the Asala and Jalacingo encomiendas. After Maria died, Carranza married Paula Dorantes, who was also a widow. He had more than 14 children. One of his children was Baltasar Dorantes de Carranza, born in Mexico in the mid-16th century, who had served as treasurer in Veracruz and procurator of Mexico in Castile. And then Estebanico. Estebanico went and he apparently was killed by Pueblo Indians because he demanded gold or something. But I heard theories that, well, actually in the Wikipedia article, okay, so some historians suggest the Zuni did not believe Estebanico's story. Okay, in 1536, Estebanico accompanied Friar Marcos de Niza as a guide in search of the fabled 7 cities of Cibola, proceeding Coronado by a year. Estebanico traveled ahead of the main party with a group of Sonoran Indians. He was instructed to communicate by sending back crosses to the main party, with the size of the cross equal to the wealth discovered. One day, a cross arrived that was as tall as a person, causing Niza to step up his pace to join the scouts. Estebanico entered the Zuni village of Hawiku in present-day New Mexico. He was sent a gourd. The Zuni reportedly killed him and expelled the Mexican Indians with him from the village. After seeing this, Niza quickly returned to New Spain. Some historians suggest the Zuni did not believe Estebanico's story that he represented a party of whites, and that he was killed for demanding turquoise. Roberts write that still others suggest that Esteban, who was black and wore feathers and rattles, may have looked like a wizard to the Zuni. Both theories are speculation. Juan Francisco Maura suggested in 2002 that the Zuni did not kill Estebanico and that he and friends among the Indians faked his death so he could gain freedom from the slavery. Some folklore legends suggest that the Kachina figure Chacuaina is based on Estebanico. Cabeza de Vaca, he ended up, like I said, he ended up going becoming governor of Argentina in 1540. And he worked to build up the population of Buenos Aires, where settlement had declined due to poor administration. Cabeza de Vaca was transported to Spain for trial in 1545. Although his sentence was eventually commuted, he never returned to the Americas. He died in Seville. Yeah. So he, and that was the expedition. And could you imagine being lost for 8 years in an unknown land and having to become a shaman to survive? I mean, this sounds like something out of Lord of the Rings. It sounds like something out of the craziest adventure novel that you will ever read in your life. And yet it happened for real. And then you think about things like Donald Trump is president of the United States now and all this other crazy shit. And I don't know, we live in a simulation, man. We fucking live in a simulation, yo. I don't know what other way to put it. It's just insanity. But yeah, that's I guess that's all I wanted to say. I guess you just really need to read this book, or listen to the audiobook. It's The Journey of Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca. That's the name of the audiobook by LibriVox. It's in the public domain. It's totally free. You can find it on YouTube. It's great for like 4, almost 5 hour track. It's really entertaining. The time flew when I was listening to it. And yeah, it's such a great tale. It's such a great tale. And I love it. You know, this dude was a warrior and he had to become a shaman to survive. So this is it's an amazing thing. And the conquistadors, you know, I have, you know, obviously some of their blood in me, as well as some African, and obviously Native American blood, because you know, Latinos are a mix of all of that. Um, I still think that the conquistadors are kind of dickheads. You know, I think that's kind of like the general sentiment among Latinos is the conquistadors are kind of a little bit of a dickhead. You know, they kind of came through, raped everybody, and that's the only reason why we're descended from them. Um, but you have to give it up to them, man. They had perseverance. These dudes were traveling in wooden boats that sometimes were rotting by the time they got to America. And they conquered civilizations that were vast. And, you know, there's this myth that, look, the Aztecs were killing people like a motherfucker. So it's, you know, the conquest, while it's shitty that it happened, it's, at the end of the day, it wasn't like these dudes, you know, like the Taino, the people in Puerto Rico, the natives of Puerto Rico. It is kind of fucked up that the Spanish came through and enslaved them to the point that they became extinct as an independent people, you know. They raped most of the women, and then they raised the kids as Spaniards, and that's why Puerto Ricans, when you test our DNA, on our mother's side, we're like, you know, 70% Native American, with some Spaniard, you know, and then we got Spaniard and African as well on our father's side. But yeah, you know, these dudes raped the shit out of the women, killed the men, and whitewashed the children, and they did a whole bunch of bad shit, and it was pretty bad. But then you go to like places like Mexico, and they were fighting against empires, you know, and at that point, all empires are shitty. I don't give a fuck where they're from, who they are. All empires are shitty. And somebody is calling me, so I'm gonna have to